Put a 1970s sitcom episode and a 2020 sitcom episode side by side, and time them both with a stopwatch. The older one will almost certainly run longer, even though it aired in the exact same 30-minute broadcast slot as its modern counterpart. Count the jokes in each one, and the newer episode will likely pack in nearly 3 times as many per minute. Look at the families on screen, and there's a real chance the older show features 2 married parents and their biological kids, while the newer one features something that would have been almost unrecognizable as a sitcom family 50 years ago. Something changed. Not just the jokes, not just the cameras, but the actual underlying architecture of what a sitcom even is, measured in real, countable numbers, not just vague nostalgia or vibes. And once you actually look at those numbers side by side, the differences are a lot stranger and a lot more specific than most people realize. Here's the part that might catch you off guard though. A lot of what feels like a modern show being funnier, faster, and better than the old ones isn't really a story about comedy improving over time. It's a story about a slowly shrinking clock, a media landscape training your brain to expect a completely different rhythm than the one audiences were trained on 50 years ago. By the end of this video, you'll have actual numbers behind almost everything that's changed: the runtime, the joke density, the family structures, the visual grammar, and you'll understand exactly why comparing an old sitcom to a new one isn't really comparing 2 versions of the same thing. It's closer to comparing 2 different inventions that happen to share a name. Let's start with something almost nobody thinks to measure, but which quietly reshapes everything else about the format: the actual length of the episode itself. When I Love Lucy premiered in the early 1950s, a standard half-hour sitcom slot delivered somewhere around 25 to 26 minutes of actual content. That number held relatively steady for decades, but according to researchers who've tracked episode metadata across dozens of American sitcoms from the 1950s through the 2010s, that runtime has been steadily shrinking the entire time, down to roughly 20 to 21 minutes by the middle of the 2010s. And that decline hasn't stopped. Some CBS multi-camera comedies airing more recently have reportedly run as short as 18 or 19 minutes inside their official 30-minute broadcast slot, compared to the 22 minutes that used to be standard for a sitcom in the 1980s. That missing time didn't just evaporate, it got sold. As advertising became more competitive and more valuable, networks steadily carved additional minutes out of every broadcast hour to sell to sponsors, shaving a little more content off the actual show each time. A viewer in 2024 watching a half-hour network sitcom is, in a very literal, measurable sense, getting several fewer minutes of story than a viewer got from the exact same time slot 40 years earlier, even though both viewers sat down for what was technically labeled a 30-minute show. Stretch that gap across an entire 22-episode season, and a modern network sitcom viewer can end up watching well over an hour less total story per year than a viewer following an equivalent show from the 1980s, without ever consciously noticing the difference, because each individual episode only lost a minute or 2 at a time. Streaming complicates this comparison even further, in a way that's worth pausing on. Without commercial breaks to sell around, streaming comedies aren't bound by the same rigid time slot math at all, which is part of why episode lengths on platforms like Netflix or Hulu can vary wildly from one episode to the next. 16 minutes one week, 34 the next, entirely dictated by how much story a given episode actually needs, rather than how much airtime a network has already promised to advertisers. In some ways, that's a genuine creative liberation. In other ways, it means the tight, reliably paced half-hour structure that trained generations of sitcom writers to be economical with every single scene is no longer a rule everyone is even working under anymore. So, if episodes have physically less time to work with, where did all that missing runtime actually get absorbed? This is where the second major shift comes in, and it's one you can genuinely count, joke by joke. Ken Jennings, yes, the Jeopardy champion, spent time researching this exact question for a book about how comedy has sped up over the decades, and the results are striking. Tracking what he called jokes per minute, counting every point where a show clearly intended the audience to laugh, Jennings found that a slower-paced 1950s sitcom, like Father Knows Best, averaged somewhere around 2.5 jokes per minute. By the 2000s and 2010s, some of the fastest-paced live-action comedies had climbed past 7 jokes per minute, nearly 3 times the joke density of a show from half a century earlier. A separate analysis conducted by The Atlantic, counting jokes across a range of popular sitcoms, found The Office landing around 6.65 jokes per minute, Friends at just over 6, and The Big Bang Theory close behind at 5.8, all clustered in what that analysis called a kind of comedic Goldilocks zone. Fast enough to feel energetic, not so relentless that it exhausts the audience. There's a specific reason widely credited with kickstarting this acceleration, and it isn't the show you'd necessarily expect. Jennings and other comedy analysts point directly at The Simpsons as the show that permanently reset audience expectations for pacing. Animation freed the show's writers from something live-action sitcoms had always been quietly constrained by: the real, physical reaction time of a studio audience. A live crowd needs a beat of silence to actually laugh before the next line lands, which naturally caps how fast a multi-camera sitcom can move. Animated comedy has no such constraint, no real audience whose laughter you need to wait out, which let The Simpsons cram in jokes, visual gags, and rapid cutaways at a pace live sitcoms simply couldn't match. That influence rippled directly into live-action comedy over the following decade, showing up in the flashback-heavy structure of Arrested Development and How I Met Your Mother, and the rapid-fire dialogue of 30 Rock, shows built by writers who'd grown up absorbing The Simpsons' cartoonishly fast rhythm and then imported it into a live-action format. Now, here's a genuinely important twist in the data, because the story isn't simply that faster automatically means better. Once jokes per minute researchers looked past the 2000s, they found the number had largely flattened out rather than continuing to climb indefinitely. And a 2015 analysis in the New York Times pointed to a real countertrend taking hold specifically among newer, more acclaimed shows, comedies increasingly willing to slow back down deliberately, leaning into more developed plot lines and quieter, more character-driven moments rather than chasing pure joke density for its own sake. Shows like Ted Lasso became a visible example of this shift, prioritizing emotional plot development over a relentless joke count, evidence that the format didn't just get faster in one straight line, it sped up dramatically, plateaued, and then, in certain corners, deliberately chose to slow back down again once audiences and writers alike started associating pure joke per minute density with something closer to exhausting than genuinely funny. While the internal rhythm of jokes was speeding up and then recalibrating, something even more fundamental was shifting simultaneously. Who was actually allowed to be at the center of a sitcom family in the first place? Family comedy in the earliest decades of American television was built almost entirely around a single template: two married, heterosexual parents, biological children, a stable, unchanging household. Shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best presenting an idealized, largely uniform version of domestic life. Television historians often point to 1966 as a genuine turning point, the year that saw two of the most archetypal traditional family sitcoms end their runs, and the arrival of Family Affair, one of the first shows to meaningfully depart from the standard two-parent household. From that point forward, the format gradually, unevenly, but persistently began making room for family structures that looked less like a single idealized mold and more like the actual range of households real viewers lived in. The Brady Bunch introduced a blended family built through remarriage. Roots and The Cosby Show brought African-American family life to the center of the screen in a television landscape that had rarely allowed it there before. Dynasty featured one of the earliest openly gay couples on American television. That expansion accelerated dramatically by the time Modern Family premiered in 2009, a show explicitly built, according to its own creators, around the idea that families are messy, complicated, and don't have to look nuclear to be genuinely, centrally worth telling stories about. The show gave equal weight and screen time to an intercultural blended family, a same-sex couple raising an adopted child, and a more traditional household that itself pointedly subverted classic gender roles, treating each arrangement not as a side character's quirky backstory, but as a fully realized, central family in its own right. According to Pew Research Center data cited in analyses of the show's cultural impact, a majority of married couples with children under 18 no longer fit the old breadwinner father, stay-at-home mother mold that had defined the genre's earliest decades. Meaning the shift on screen was, in a real sense, simply television, catching up to a demographic reality that had already changed underneath it. There's another number worth counting here, one that has nothing to do with jokes or runtime, and everything to do with what a sitcom is even legally, or at least contractually, allowed to say and show. For most of broadcast television's history, Comedy operated under strict standards and practices, review, an internal network process that vetted scripts for language, sexual content, and subject matter deemed inappropriate for a general audience watching at 7 or 8 o'clock on a weeknight. Even genuinely groundbreaking, boundary-pushing shows like All in the Family had to negotiate carefully with network censors over exactly how far a joke about race or religion could go before it crossed an unacceptable line. Streaming platforms operate under an almost entirely different set of rules, largely unbound by the same broadcast decency standards, free to let characters swear, reference drug use, or handle sexual content with a directness that would have been simply unbroadcastable on a major network 40 years earlier. That's part of why a modern streaming comedy can sit in the exact same broad genre as a classic multi-camera sitcom, while sounding, tonally, almost like it's speaking an entirely different language. Ensemble size tells a similar story of quiet, steady expansion. Researchers cataloging sitcom casts across the decades have found that the number of characters treated as genuine, regularly featured cast members has grown substantially over time, with recent ensemble comedies, like The Office and Modern Family, built around 11 to 14 significant characters, a scale that would have been almost unmanageable for an earlier sitcom built around a tight 4 or 5 person household. Part of that growth traces directly back to the workplace and mockumentary formats discussed earlier in this exact conversation, structures that made room for large casts of coworkers and extended in-laws, in a way the classic single-family living room set never really could. A bigger ensemble means more possible character pairings, more subplots running simultaneously, and, not coincidentally, more total jokes available per episode to help fill that accelerating joke-per-minute pace. So when you actually add all of this up, the runtime that quietly shrank decade after decade, the joke density that tripled and then deliberately cooled back down, the entire definition of what a sitcom family is even allowed to look like, a genuinely interesting picture emerges. One that complicates the simple idea that older sitcoms were somehow purer or that modern ones are simply superior. Neither framing really survives contact with the actual data. The old format wasn't slower because writers were less skilled. It was slower partly because a live studio audience physically needed that space to laugh, and partly because network executives hadn't yet discovered how many additional minutes of commercial time a shrinking episode could quietly absorb. The modern format isn't simply funnier. It's operating under an entirely different set of physical and cultural constraints. A shorter clock, a faster trained audience, and a far broader, far more accurate sense of what an American household actually looks like. Which means the real answer to what changed isn't really about which era of sitcoms is better than the other at all. It's that the sitcom was never really one format holding steady across 70 years, while only the jokes evolved around it. It was constantly being rebuilt, minute by minute, joke by joke, family by family, in direct response to a culture, an advertising industry, and an audience's own attention span, all three of which kept quietly, relentlessly, changing underneath it the entire time.